What are internal audits, really?
They are the company's third line of defense.
Control is essentially a look into the past.
In essence, it serves as the hands and eyes of the audit committee and supervisory bodies.
Doesn't this create a conflict of interest?
An internal auditor can provide advice but is not accountable for that advice. There are cases where not all supervisory board members are familiar with the business context.
The internal auditor is effectively already contributing to value creation for the business. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. We all know that we live in a time of constant change and uncertainty. We are all familiar with numerous acronyms such as BANI, VUCA, and others that were created to describe the world we live in today. And of course, it is characterized by a high degree of uncertainty. We see this both in the economic sphere and in the geopolitical sphere. And naturally, this business landscape requires certain changes in approaches to oversight and control. Traditional internal control mechanisms that worked in the past and were focused more on compliance are no longer sufficient to address today's challenges. At the center of all this is the role of the internal auditor, or the chief audit executive. And joining us today is our guest, Dilyara Kadamiva. Dilyara, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
The Chief Audit Executive at Kernel. She also has extensive experience in implementing internal control and audit systems across various large companies, including SCM and others. In addition, Dilyara graduated from UCGA, the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy, as well as CGPA. She is a member of the Corporate Governance Professional Association and is included in the National Register of Corporate Directors. Many business owners view internal audit as an inspector or a senior accountant whose role is to check for errors in documents. On the one hand, while on the other, some see it as an inquisitor with almost unlimited powers to conduct investigations and draw conclusions. What is internal audit in reality and what is it not?
All of that is already a legacy of the past. Today, the internal auditor plays a much broader role within a company. And today, I would describe that role as a business partner.
Many of the sources currently cited in studies related to capital preservation and internal audit emphasize that internal audit is no longer focused solely on compliance, processes, and the like, but is in fact involved in creating value for the business. How does that work?
I would start with the definition of internal audit provided by the standards. It is an independent and objective activity that contributes to value creation for the company and helps it achieve its strategic objectives through assurance, consulting, the evaluation of internal controls, and the assessment of risk management and corporate governance effectiveness. If we break that definition down into its components, it gives us a clear picture of what an internal auditor is today. And how does today's internal auditor differ from the internal auditor of the past? First of all, independence and objectivity. This is perhaps the primary value that the internal audit function provides to governing bodies, business owners, shareholders, and investors. And this value, as well as that independence, is primarily ensured by the organizational reporting structure of the internal audit function, which sits at the intersection of operational management and corporate governance bodies. The internal auditor reports functionally to the audit committee or supervisory board and administratively to the company's CEO. This reporting structure is precisely what ensures an independent and objective assessment. And that is the first source of value. Secondly, what distinguishes the updated standards from the previous ones is that today's internal auditor is focused on creating value for the company. Their work is expected to help the company achieve its objectives, not just any objectives, but the company's strategic objectives. These are new concepts that have been introduced in the updated standards. This clearly demonstrates that internal audit is moving away from its previous role, from that of a controller, so to speak, to that of a business partner. This is because its activities are now more focused on delivering value by helping the company achieve its strategic objectives.
And this is very important because control or compliance-based internal audit is essentially a look into the past. It focuses on issues and events that have already occurred, whereas a risk-based and value creation-based approach is focused on the future. What is particularly interesting is how these two approaches coexist, because control remains an integral part of internal audit.
Control remains essential, and the internal auditor is, in essence, the hands and eyes of the audit committee and the supervisory bodies. This is the most essential and fundamental tool. principal pillar of support that helps provide comprehensive oversight and instills a deep sense of confidence within the owner that the company is being overseen and managed with maximum effectiveness by the management team. Therefore, control should certainly remain in place, but at the same time, it should not be allowed to dominate the entire operation. Even in today's complex environment, the internal auditor must strive to move significantly beyond just compliance and conformity assessment. They need to carefully analyze and evaluate the latest trends, closely monitor and observe ongoing tendencies, and examine benchmarks, including both internal and external industry standard benchmarks. Every audit should begin with the company's strategy, specifically focusing on how well a particular company process is meticulously organized and structured to achieve the strategic goals that have been formally reviewed and approved by the company's supervisory board. So there is a blend of approaches within every audit engagement. In other words, we cannot completely move away from control and assessment, but at the same time, we add a very important dimension, alignment with strategy and the identification of opportunities to improve efficiency, enabling us to provide both operational management and the company's governing bodies with recommendations that support business process improvement and the achievement of strategic objectives.
Doesn't this create a conflict of interest? Because on the one hand, there is oversight and potential review, while on the other, there is advisory support and participation in value creation.
I would say that this is a recurring question, the question of conflicts of interest. Today, as the function evolves and changes its role, there is also a set of safeguards in place that help prevent conflicts of interest. First of all, to maintain the independence and objectivity of both their advice and their function as a whole, internal auditors cannot make management decisions. In other words, they can provide advice, but they are not accountable for that advice and do not make management decisions. As a business partner, an internal auditor may participate, for example, in working groups responsible for implementing recommendations that affect business process transformation. However, within such a working group, the internal auditor acts as an advisor rather than an implementer. They are not responsible for execution. Execution remains the responsibility of management. In this context, the role of internal audit is primarily advisory, and that is precisely what helps ensure its independence. I would also like to add that if, for any reason, independence has been compromised, the matter must be escalated to the audit committee. If an internal auditor, acting as a professional guided by ethical principles, recognizes that their independence has been compromised and that a potential conflict of interest has arisen, they must bring it before the audit committee. In most cases, the decision is made that for a certain period of time, the internal auditor will not be involved in the assessment or audit of the process where independence was compromised. If it becomes necessary to assess the effectiveness of this process, an external consultant will be engaged. So in principle, there are sufficient safeguards in place to prevent conflicts of interest.
Diliara, as I understand it, you either conduct or are preparing to conduct courses at KMBS, the Kyiv Mohila Business School, including topics related to risk management. How do internal audit and risk management relate to one another within organizations?
Currently, I am a visiting lecturer at KMBS and have already participated in MBA programs on corporate governance. And now I am preparing my own program, the topic of which is the risk of strategy implementation in a company. It was a joint decision with KMBS that, given the constant challenges companies face today, organizations must be able to respond to those challenges proactively, that is, to work preventively with risks that may affect the achievement of their strategic objectives. That is why this topic is so important.
Is risk management in corporations always separated from internal audit? Or are there companies where both functions operate within the same department or team?
It depends on the organizational structure and the size of the company. There are companies where risk management and internal audit are separate functions, and there are companies where they are combined within a single department. Both models have a right to exist. However, if we look at the standards, best practice is to keep these functions separate. This is because internal audit serves as the company's third line of defense, and it reports functionally to the audit committee. Risk management, on the other hand, represents the company's second line of defense, and it reports functionally to the company's CEO. In essence, it helps the company manage its risks.
Many business owners believe that internal audit and risk management are attributes of only very large and highly structured companies. How would you explain the agency problem and the three lines of defense to the owner of a mid-sized business, for example, one with annual sales of 50 million?
This is a frequently encountered and widely discussed perspective that is very common among many small to medium-sized business enterprises today. But my response is always the same. Any function can be adapted. In essence, internal audit and risk management should not necessarily be viewed as separate organizational units. In this context, they should be seen as functions that can be carried out by different departments within the company. Small and medium-sized businesses do not necessarily need a dedicated risk manager or a dedicated internal auditor. What matters is that these responsibilities are separated. And it is very important for small and medium-sized businesses to understand what these functions are and what value they bring to the business. Only then can they determine what capabilities they need today and who can perform these roles. It may even be an external consultant. There may be no need for a full-time internal auditor, while the internal audit function can be performed by an external advisor. What is important is that the business owner understands why they need an internal auditor and why they need that external expertise. What value it will bring to the business. It is very similar to corporate governance in small and medium-sized businesses. Everyone tends to think it is the prerogative of large companies, yet advisory boards can be extremely valuable for both small and medium-sized businesses and can deliver significant benefits. The key is not to create formal structures for the sake of it, but to adapt functions in a way that delivers maximum value to a business of any size. When we talk about the agency problem, we should remember that operational management primarily acts as agents, and operational management may naturally be focused on achieving its own short-term interests and objectives. Let us take KPIs as an example. KPIs assigned to operational management are typically set for a period of 12 months or 1 year. As a result, management may not always be motivated to focus on, and more often than not, it is motivated to achieve those annual targets and earn the associated bonus. But in order for a company to exist, it must ensure the achievement of long-term objectives. And this is exactly where internal audit and risk management help solve the agency problem. There is a very strong concept that I like a lot. It is the concept of the three lines of defense in business. How does it work? What I like most is when it is presented as a triangle. And our first such layer is operational management. And operational management is responsible for the company's risks. It is responsible for identifying risks, assessing risks, and managing risks on the ground as part of day-to-day operational activity. The second line of defense consists of control functions within the company that are part of operational management. These include security, risk management if it exists in the company, compliance if it exists, or if not, some departments still perform compliance-related functions. This also includes the CFO. In fact, C-level executives are also part of the second line of defense. The CEO is also part of the second line of defense, and the second line helps set the tone from the top and approve risk management methodologies. A risk committee may also be created, which essentially supports the entire risk management system. It serves as a system essentially to systematically manage the company's risks at the first line of defense. And of course, at the top of the triangle, we have the supervisory bodies and internal audit. This is the third line of defense, which performs oversight and is responsible for assessing how effective the second and first lines of defense are, or rather, how effectively the first line of defense manages risks and internal controls within the company, and how effectively the second line of defense supports this and sets the overall tone.
Dilyara, you mentioned that any system being implemented must take into account the size of the company, the scale of its operations, and the complexity of its processes. So how do we ensure that the system remains flexible and does not create unnecessary bureaucracy?
After all, companies today must be flexible, or, in other words, able to quickly adapt to changes in the external environment. And internal audit in the same way cannot stand apart. Internal audit and risk management are part of the company and must be fully synchronized with the overall management system. And likewise, they must be flexible and able to adapt quickly. As an example, speaking about the internal audit function at Kernel, we have significantly changed our approach to planning in order to ensure much greater flexibility in our operations. We are moving toward a dynamic annual planning model that is continuously reviewed on a quarterly basis by the audit committee. Because the situation is constantly changing and the audits that were planned at the beginning of the year may become irrelevant in the second half of the year, while other projects become more relevant. The same applies to risks. The nature of risks cannot be expected to remain constant. Even if we have already approved a specific risk map, it is highly likely to fluctuate and change on multiple different occasions throughout the entire year. Therefore, both of these processes, internal audit and risk management, must be as flexible as possible and change as frequently as the business context changes.
Diliara, internal audit, and risk management are very often associated with boards of directors, corporate governance, and supervisory boards. Although, in reality, internal audit can probably exist even without a supervisory board. On the other hand, a supervisory board is unlikely to function effectively without internal audit. Could you share your perspective on these interdependencies, internal audit, corporate governance, and strategic governing bodies, including the supervisory board?
First, if we talk about whether a company can have internal audit without supervisory governing bodies, yes, it can. And in fact, this has been the case for quite a long time because companies started establishing internal audit functions. I don't know, over the last 10 years, this has been a very active trend, or even longer. If we talk about corporate governance bodies, this is probably more of a trend of the last 5 years, let's say. In other words, internal audit appeared in companies earlier, and essentially it evolved from, as you mentioned at the beginning, control and inspection departments, gradually transforming just as business models and businesses themselves evolve. It transformed into an internal audit function with greater expertise and one that focuses not only on control, but also on creating value for the business through consulting projects, operational efficiency improvements, and support in building internal control and risk management systems. And if we engage in a discussion regarding whether corporate governance bodies can function and operate effectively without internal audit, yes, they certainly can. But in my personal opinion, it will be considerably more challenging and complex to manage in the long run. But why? This is because corporate governance bodies operate above the process. They have minimal involvement in operational management, and they are not part of the organizational structure or, in general, the company's culture. They are not involved in the company's day-to-day life. Well, they are, let's say, more detached from the reality of the company's business than internal audit, which is part of the business's organizational structure. Therefore, of course, it becomes significantly more effective when corporate governance bodies establish a dedicated internal audit function, which essentially acts as a vital assistant in successfully achieving their long-term organizational goals and objectives.
What do owners, shareholders, and the board of directors or supervisory board usually expect from internal audit reports?
First of all, they expect objectivity of judgment and objectivity of conclusions. Second, they expect an accurate reflection of the situation as it is, a reflection of the reality of how the business operates today. And third, they certainly expect recommendations that create value for the company and help it improve its efficiency.
I really liked an idea from one of the discussions that strategy is not only about what a company should do and what it should be, but also about what it should not do and what it should not be. Probably the same applies to internal audit results. They may consist not only in achieving something, but also in preventing something. In other words, a risk that did not materialize or that materialized and was promptly addressed in some way is probably an achievement of internal audit as a system.
As part of its projects, internal audit identifies the risks faced by a process. Yes, it prioritizes those risks within processes or anything else within the company that is subject to audit. This could be a significant contract, for example, or it could involve certain transactions. Therefore, this is extremely important, and this is precisely one of the key values of internal audit. It brings to light risks that may be unknown or not fully visible at the level of supervisory bodies, helping ensure that decision makers have a more complete view of potential exposures, vulnerabilities, and emerging threats that could affect the company's objectives.
Can internal audit help identify internal efficiency reserves that, for example, may not be visible to the CEO?
Absolutely, and I would say this happens very often. And why? Because operational management is involved in its routine processes on a daily basis, and it may fail to notice certain things that from the perspective of lost opportunities or efficiency improvements are actually quite visible. On the one hand, the internal audit function is part of the company, but on the other hand, it is not involved in operational activities. Essentially, its work is project-based, and it also operates above operational management, which allows it to assess processes objectively and independently. to look at a process objectively and independently and identify through its expertise, experience, and various external benchmarks, for example, comparisons with competitors and an understanding of market trends, those things that management may not notice within the framework of its daily routine.
You have participated in establishing internal audit in large companies. If we talk about a business owner who has decided to implement internal audit and risk management in their company, where should they begin?
Yes, this is a very relevant question. Why? Let me explain. Because in principle, the role of internal audit in a company depends on the expectations and objectives that the owner sets for internal audit, and it can vary significantly depending on that. There are companies, well, it also depends on the company's level of maturity. Perhaps in companies where internal control and risk management systems are currently not very developed, companies that are at an early stage of development and scaling, owners expect internal audit to help build internal controls and risk management systems and to perform more of a control function. In companies where that are already, well, most often large, established and transparent businesses with mature processes and embedded controls, and where risk management already exists, even if it is not formalized, owners most often expect audit to act as a business partner, providing advice on how to improve processes, how they can be transformed, and where efficiency reserves exist within those processes. Their expectations from the internal audit function are closer to having an internal McKinsey, essentially an in-house consultant. Therefore, it depends on the company's level of maturity, and essentially this influences the owner's expectations. And overall, the company's level of maturity and the owner's plans for the company and its development also matter, whether the goal is simply to increase transparency in order to attract external financing in the future, or whether the owner has plans for large-scale growth, expansion into new markets, entry into foreign markets, or the launch of new products. And this also affects the role of internal audit. Therefore, it is very important to discuss this from the very beginning. It affects how internal audit in a company will structure its work and ensures that the owner's expectations are met.
Dilyara, you probably interact regularly with the supervisory boards of companies within the groups where you work. Are there any red flags that supervisory boards consistently overlook or fail to pay attention to, even though they are very important?
I sometimes encounter situations where supervisory boards, based on all of my previous experience, include members who do not fully understand the business context. And this is precisely where not all the necessary questions are always asked by supervisory board members, questions that would be useful in challenging operational management and encouraging them to conduct more thorough and preventive risk assessments regarding certain actions. For example, even if we talk about today, in the era of digital transformation, and the widespread adoption of AI across businesses. No matter whom you ask, everyone is implementing AI. Every conference includes discussions about AI adoption, yet not every supervisory board is involved in these processes. And the implementation of AI is a process that carries significant risks for businesses. Implementing AI is not only about creating AI assistants. More often, it is about improving the efficiency of a particular employee's work. However, when AI implementation progresses to the stage of creating AI agents that become embedded into processes and take responsibility for part of those processes, and when management starts relying on activities already performed by AI rather than employees, and supervisory boards begin making decisions based on projects or
Submitted reports.
Yes, reports that may already be partially generated by AI, then very significant risks arise regarding whether the AI agent was implemented correctly and whether all risks associated with its implementation were properly assessed. And this is exactly where, in my view, there is currently a gap on the part of supervisory boards. They have not yet fully realized their role within this digital transformation and revolution.
Yes, moreover, awareness of artificial intelligence among supervisory boards is probably still quite low. Many people believe they understand AI simply because they use ChatGPT, but in reality, it is a much deeper concept that can be used far more extensively in business and business processes, while also creating substantial risks.
Yes, absolutely. Therefore, first of all, an AI implementation strategy within the company is a must for the supervisory board to review and approve. And AI projects that directly affect the transformation of the business model have now also become a matter for supervisory boards.
From time to time, when looking at skills matrices developed for boards, I see internal audit expertise included among them. meaning a board member is expected to possess internal audit expertise. How useful do you think this expertise is for a board member?
It is useful, especially if we are talking about the audit committee, because an internal auditor understands how processes should be designed, how a company's internal control system should be built, and how its risk management system should be structured. If we are talking about an experienced and professional internal auditor, then such a person also understands compliance processes and the compliance function as a whole, is knowledgeable about security functions and various ethical issues related to company activities, and also understands strategy and strategic management in general. In my view, the key advantage of an internal auditor as a member of a supervisory board is that they are not part of operational management and have experience precisely in exercising oversight without crossing the line into micromanagement or interfering with operational management. At the same time, they understand the business and are not detached from the business context, and a supervisory board member with internal audit experience can very easily identify risks, warning indicators, and areas that require attention, while also possessing broad expertise in financial management, investment management, and strategic management. Therefore, this is undoubtedly an advantage.
How much can the board lose if it lacks such expertise? Most likely, there will be issues that the board fails to notice or does not pay sufficient attention to, although it should, and this may create either potential problems or missed opportunities.
Yes, I definitely think that all of these serious risks you've just mentioned, they really do exist in our world today. There will simply be a certain degree of detachment from the business and an incomplete understanding of all risks. There may also be neglect of critical issues and insufficient attention paid to them. And it is also very important to say in this context that a good internal auditor is not only someone who possesses professional skills or what we call hard skills. The head of internal audit must also possess highly developed soft skills and leadership skills. And these are precisely the qualities that make someone a successful supervisory board member, because a supervisory board is also a team that must build effective relationships with business owners, operational management, external auditors, and in general protect the interests of all stakeholders. This is exactly where internal audit experience becomes valuable. Throughout your work, you constantly conduct interviews, continuously operate between operational management and supervisory bodies, and have the opportunity to develop communication skills, independent judgment, the ability to formulate recommendations, and the ability to maintain constructive dialogue with different stakeholders.
How useful can such expertise, namely internal audit expertise, be for a board member if this function has not yet been established or fully implemented in the company? To what extent can a board member avoid involvement in operational matters while still helping to implement or strengthen this function?
In my view, this creates additional value because if a company does not have internal audit or risk management functions, but there is a member of the supervisory board or advisory board with such experience, then that person generally understands how these functions can be covered within the company's existing structure. For example, even if we take compliance, very few businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, have a dedicated compliance officer. This is something we encounter very rarely, yet compliance risks are highly relevant today. If a person cannot identify compliance risks, they will not be able to allocate authority and responsibility for managing those compliance risks among their personnel. If there is a board member who understands compliance or risk management, that person can ask the right question. Who in the company is responsible for managing this particular compliance risk? And who in the company, for example, conducts due diligence reviews of counterparties? And who in the company checks sanctions compliance? In principle, all of these things can be established even if the company does not currently have them in place, and even in the absence of people specifically responsible for these functions. At the same time, there should be someone on the board who understands what these functions are, what value they can bring to the company, what risks they mitigate, and what expertise is required to address them. If a company's controls or procedures aren't formalized, it doesn't mean that internal controls do not exist within the company. They do exist. The same applies to risks. If a risk management methodology is not formalized within a company and there is no dedicated CRO responsible for implementing this methodology, it does not mean that the company does not manage risks. As people, we manage risks constantly. We wake up, get out of bed, and we are already managing risks. what the weather is like, whether we should take an umbrella, whether there is traffic, whether it is better to get to a meeting by metro or by car. We manage risks all the time. The same applies to business. Risk management may be informal, but companies manage risks continuously. And here it is important to have someone who simply helps the organization approach this consciously. You may not have formalized procedures or a dedicated person in charge, but if there is someone who highlights these issues, asks the right questions, suggests what additional training may be needed, and generally helps address these processes more consciously and professionally, it creates significant value for the company. The same principle applies to risk management, identifying it, assessing it, and making a decision about what we are going to do with it. Whether we leave it as it is, transfer it to another party, completely shut down that activity, or take steps to reduce the risk. Once you understand these basic principles, and when there is someone who draws your attention to them, you simply approach these matters more consciously. It is not always necessary to have a separate person within operational management who constantly acts as a controller and pushes management by saying, let's identify risks, let's assess them, let's create a risk map. That is not always necessary, but if, for example, there is someone on an advisory board who has this experience and expertise, that person will ask the right questions, highlight these issues, and management will simply begin to approach them differently. In other words, the absence of formalization does not mean the absence of a process.
Dilyara, thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, for the valuable insights, and for such a professional deep dive into the topics of internal audit and risk management. Thank you very much.
Yes, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the invitation, for this wonderful and unique opportunity to have such a constructive dialogue, to raise these important topics, and to provide much-needed clarity and insight into them.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on our channel.